There are places in America where history feels heavier than stone. Places where every wall seems to remember something. Alcatraz Island is one of them. Most people know it as the prison that once held some of the country's most dangerous criminals. They know about the escape attempts, the isolation, and the freezing waters that surrounded it. But according to those who worked there, the prison held something else, something that never appeared in official records, something that may have remained on the island long after the last inmate left. The story begins in the winter of 1948. A bitter wind swept across San Francisco Bay as preparations were underway for the annual Christmas gathering hosted by Warden James Johnston. Unlike the prison blocks below, the warden's residence felt warm and welcoming. Decorations lined the walls, laughter echoed through the rooms. Staff members and their families gathered together, eager to enjoy one evening that felt removed from the harsh realities of prison life. For a few hours, Alcatraz almost felt normal. Almost. As the evening progressed, Johnston moved among his guests, exchanging greetings and checking that everyone was enjoying themselves. That was when he noticed someone he didn't recognize. Standing near the far side of the room was a man dressed unlike anyone else at the party. His clothes looked old, not old-fashioned, old. The fabric appeared worn by years of labor. His boots were scuffed and stained. Thick mutton chop sideburns framed his face, giving him an appearance that seemed strangely disconnected from the decade around him. Johnston paused. He knew nearly everyone attending. The island wasn't large enough for strangers. Yet there the man stood, silent, watching. For reasons Johnston could never fully explain, an uneasy feeling settled over him. Then, the temperature dropped. At first, it was subtle. A few guests rubbed their arms. Others glanced toward the windows. Within seconds, the warmth vanished completely. A cold unlike anything outside began spreading through the room. Several people later recalled seeing their own breath. The nearby stove suddenly sputtered, then went dark. Conversations stopped. The entire room seemed frozen in place. Nobody understood what was happening. Johnston fixed his eyes on the stranger. The man hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, hadn't spoken a single word. Slowly, Johnston stepped forward. The room was silent except for the sound of his footsteps. One step, then another. The stranger continued watching him. And then, without warning, the figure disappeared. Not gradually, not into another room, not behind another guest. One moment he was standing there. The next moment, he was gone, completely. The silence that followed felt almost unnatural. Within minutes, the warmth returned. The stove reignited. People began talking again, but something had changed. As guests compared what they had witnessed, Johnston made a disturbing discovery. He wasn't the only person who had seen the stranger. Several guests described the exact same man, the same clothing, the same sideburns, the same expression, and none of them had ever seen him before. Years later, Johnston would continue searching for an explanation. What none of those guests realized that Christmas night was that the mysterious visitor may have been connected to a much darker story hidden deep within the prison itself, a story that had already begun years earlier inside one of Alcatraz's most feared isolation cells, Cell 14D. Long before the strange visitor appeared at the warden's Christmas party, another incident had quietly become part of Alcatraz folklore. It was a story few guards liked to discuss, Even fewer were willing to discuss it after sunset. The story centered around a punishment cell deep inside D Block, Cell 14D. Unlike ordinary prison cells, 14D had been designed to strip away nearly everything. There was no comfort, no distraction, and almost no light. Once the heavy outer door closed, darkness swallowed the room completely. Many inmates feared the cell more than they feared the prison itself. In the early 1940s, a troublesome prisoner was escorted down the corridor after repeated disciplinary violations. Witnesses later recalled that he fought the guards every step of the way. He kicked, he cursed, he threatened everyone around him. Yet the moment the door to 14D slammed shut behind him, something changed. For the first several hours, his voice continued echoing through D Block. The guards paid little attention. Prisoners often shouted after being placed in isolation. It was nothing unusual. But as night approached, the tone of his voice began to change. The anger disappeared. Fear took its place. The prisoner started begging to be released. At first, the guards assumed he was trying a different tactic. Then came the words that would be remembered for decades. "He isn't leaving me alone." The statement confused everyone. The prisoner was alone, or at least he was supposed to be. One guard eventually approached the cell carrying the man's evening meal. When he opened the outer door and prepared to slide the food through the bars, a hand suddenly shot from the darkness and grabbed his sleeve. The guard stumbled backward. The prisoner's face looked different, terrified. His eyes darted wildly toward the darkness behind him. He pleaded to be moved, not tomorrow, not later, immediately. The guard demanded an explanation. The prisoner lowered his voice. Then he pointed into the blackness behind him. According to later accounts, he claimed there was another presence inside the cell, something watching him, something that moved whenever the light disappeared. The prisoner described seeing a pair of glowing red eyes staring at him in the corner, eyes that never blinked, never looked away. He then showed the guard several fresh scratches running across his arms. The marks appeared recent, but the guard refused to believe the story. After all, there was nobody else inside the cell. The meal was pushed through the bars, the doors were closed, and once again, cell 14D vanished into darkness. As midnight approached, the prisoner's screams became impossible to ignore. They echoed through the corridors. Other inmates shouted for him to be quiet. Some guards considered moving him. Others believed he was suffering from panic brought on by isolation. Hours passed. The screams became weaker, then frantic sobbing, then whispers, then silence, complete silence. For the remainder of the night, no sound emerged from cell 14D. When morning arrived, guards made their rounds as usual. One by one, the cell doors opened. Eventually, they reached 14D. As the heavy door swung inward, the officers immediately realized something was wrong. The prisoner wasn't standing. He wasn't speaking. He wasn't moving at all. He lay motionless in the center of the floor, dead. What happened next would become one of the most debated stories in Alcatraz history, because according to prison legends, the marks found on the prisoner's neck suggested he had not died alone. And in the years that followed, rumors began spreading throughout the prison. Rumors that something unseen lived inside cell 14D, waiting, watching, patiently searching for its next victim. The death inside cell 14D should have faded into prison history. Official reports were filed. Questions were asked. Time moved forward. But Alcatraz had a way of holding on to its secrets. In the months following the prisoner's death, whispers began spreading among both guards and inmates. Most dismissed the stories as nothing more than fear amplified by isolation. Yet the rumors refused to disappear. Instead, they grew. Several inmates housed near D Block claimed they occasionally awoke during the night to the sound of footsteps moving slowly through the corridor. The strange part wasn't the footsteps themselves, it was the timing. The sounds often occurred during periods when no guards were scheduled to patrol that section of the prison. At first, prisoners assumed someone was breaking protocol, but whenever they looked through the bars of their cells, the corridor appeared empty. The footsteps would continue for several seconds, then suddenly stop, as though whoever was walking had simply vanished. Years passed, stories accumulated. One inmate claimed he woke to find two red points of light staring at him from the far end of D Block. Another reported hearing someone whisper his name from outside his cell, despite nobody being there. Most of these accounts never made it beyond prison gossip. Until Rufus McCain arrived. McCain was already known throughout the prison system, a convicted bank robber with a reputation for stubbornness and defiance. He had little interest in prison legends. Ghost stories didn't scare him. People did. That confidence began to change after a failed escape attempt in 1939. Following the incident, McCain and several others were punished with extended isolation. His destination was cell 14D. At first, nothing unusual happened. Days passed, then weeks. The isolation began taking its toll. When guards interacted with him, they noticed subtle changes. McCain spoke less. His sleep appeared irregular. Dark circles formed beneath his eyes. But the most unsettling change was his behavior whenever he left the cell. He constantly looked behind him, not occasionally, constantly, even while speaking, even while eating, even while walking. It was as if someone was following him, or something. One guard later recalled catching McCain staring into an empty corner for nearly 10 minutes without moving. When asked what he was looking at, the inmate refused to answer. Another officer reported hearing McCain muttering to himself late at night. The words were mostly unintelligible, except for one phrase: "It's still here." Months later, his punishment finally ended. McCain was released back into the general prison population. Physically, he seemed healthy. Mentally, he was different. The confident criminal who had entered 14D was gone. In his place was a nervous, withdrawn man who rarely trusted anyone. Other inmates noticed it too. Some claimed he flinched whenever shadows moved unexpectedly. Others reported that he avoided certain hallways altogether. Whatever had happened inside cell 14D, McCain never publicly explained it, and perhaps he couldn't, because not long after his release, violence erupted in the prison yard. A confrontation between inmates quickly escalated. By the time guards intervened, McCain had been fatally stabbed. His death was officially ruled a homicide. Case closed. But prison rumors told a different story. Many inmates believed that whatever had terrified him inside cell 14D had never truly let him go. That somehow, even after leaving the isolation cell, part of him remained trapped there, watching, waiting. And decades later, when the prison finally closed and tourists began walking the abandoned corridors, reports of the red-eyed figure would begin appearing once again, this time from people who had never spent a single night behind bars. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, Many people assumed its stories would disappear along with the inmates. The prison stood silent, its corridors emptied, the steel doors no longer slammed shut at night. For a while, it seemed as though the island's darker chapters had finally come to an end. But the silence didn't last. As the years passed, former employees occasionally returned to visit the island. Tourists arrived in growing numbers, eager to explore one of America's most infamous prisons. That was when a new pattern began to emerge. The reports were different from the stories told by prisoners. These people had never been locked inside a cell. They had no reason to fear the place. Many arrived as skeptics, yet some left with questions they couldn't answer. One visitor claimed she heard someone whisper directly into her ear while standing alone inside D Block. When she turned around, there was nobody there. Another tourist reported seeing a figure standing motionless at the end of a corridor. Believing it to be another visitor, he walked toward it. The figure vanished before he could reach it. Others described hearing distant cries echoing through parts of the prison that were completely empty. Park employees heard the stories regularly. Most dismissed them. Old buildings made strange noises. Wind created odd acoustics. Human imagination filled in the rest. At least that was the official explanation. Then the staff themselves started experiencing things. A maintenance worker reported hearing metal doors slam repeatedly inside an empty section of the prison. When he investigated, every door remained exactly where it should have been. A guide leading a tour group claimed she felt someone shove her from behind while walking through an isolated corridor. She turned, expecting to find a visitor standing there. Nobody was present. Several employees independently reported sudden temperature drops in specific areas of D Block. Not gradual changes, instant changes. One moment comfortable, the next moment freezing. The descriptions were remarkably consistent, and one detail kept appearing over and over again: the sensation of being watched. Many witnesses struggled to explain it. They simply felt that something was observing them from nearby, hidden, patient, unseen. Then came an incident that deeply unsettled several long-time employees. A group of visitors touring the prison separately approached staff with nearly identical descriptions of a man they believed was part of the historical presentation. According to each witness, the man wore old-fashioned work clothes. His appearance seemed oddly out of place. He didn't speak. He simply stood observing the area. The problem was that no such employee existed. Security records showed nobody matching the description had entered the prison that day. When staff compared the accounts, another unsettling realization emerged. The description closely matched the mysterious figure reportedly seen decades earlier at Warden Johnston's Christmas party. The same clothes, the same facial hair, the same silent stare. Word of the connection spread quietly among employees. Most avoided discussing it publicly, but privately, some began wondering whether the various stories surrounding Alcatraz were not separate incidents at all. What if the various stories surrounding Alcatraz were not separate incidents at all? What if the strange visitor, the whispers, the unexplained cold spots, and the stories from cell 14D all pointed toward the same presence? Nobody had an answer. Yet within a few years, a newly hired park ranger would move closer to that answer than anyone before him. His name was Dan McCleskey, and his encounter would become one of the most terrifying stories ever associated with Alcatraz Island.
Dan Molesky didn't believe in ghost stories. At least, not at first. He had spent years working in law enforcement, before taking a position as a park ranger at Alcatraz. To him, the island was just another assignment. Old buildings, heavy history, and too many exaggerated stories from tourists looking for entertainment. His first few days on the island were uneventful. Routine inspections, guided tours, quiet nights. Nothing unusual. Until his third week. It happened during a late evening patrol of D Block. The corridors were nearly empty at that hour, lit only by dim overhead lights that flickered occasionally, casting long shadows across the iron doors. Dan moved slowly, checking each section as part of standard procedure. That was when he heard it. A metallic sound, sharp, distinct, coming from somewhere behind him. He stopped walking, listened. Nothing. Then, clang. The sound echoed again, closer this time. Dan turned on his flashlight and swept it across the corridor. The beam cut through rows of identical cell doors. At first, everything looked normal. Then he noticed one of them. A cell door was slightly ajar, moving, as if it had just been opened. Dan frowned. He called out, half expecting one of the other rangers to respond. No answer came. He walked closer. Each step echoed through the empty corridor. When he reached the cell, the door was now completely open. Inside was nothing, just a cot, a rusted toilet, and darkness that seemed deeper than the rest of the prison. Dan hesitated, then stepped inside. The air changed immediately. It felt colder. He turned in a slow circle, scanning the room with his flashlight. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just empty space. He exhaled sharply. "Real funny," he muttered, assuming one of the other rangers had staged a prank. Then, clang. The sound came from right behind him. Dan spun around instantly. The cell door had shut. Not slammed, not gently closed by the wind. It had moved with intention, locked him inside. A strange silence followed, the kind that feels heavier than sound. Dan approached the door, testing it. It didn't budge. For the first time that night, he felt something he couldn't explain. Not fear, exactly. Something deeper. Awareness, as if the cell was no longer empty. The temperature dropped again, fast. His breath became visible in the beam of his flashlight. Dan stepped back slowly, scanning the corners. That's when he saw it. At first, it looked like a distortion in the wall, a shadow that didn't match the light. Then, it moved. The darkness near the far corner separated from the wall, not like a person stepping forward, more like something peeling itself out of the darkness. Dan froze. The shape continued forming. Arms, a torso, a head, featureless, but present. And then, 2 points of light appeared where the eyes should have been. Faint, red, watching. Dan backed away, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The light flickered. The shape moved closer, slowly, deliberately. The flashlight slipped from his grip and hit the floor. The beam tilted upward, casting broken shadows across the cell. In that fractured light, the figure became clearer. Not human, not fully formed, but aware. Dan screamed. The sound echoed violently through the corridor outside the cell. Seconds later, footsteps rushed toward D Block.
Rangers shouting, keys clanking. The outer door was forced open. Light flooded the cell, but there was nothing inside. Only Dan, collapsed near the wall, shaking, breathing hard, eyes fixed on the empty corner where the figure had stood. When asked what he saw, Dan couldn't fully explain it. Only one detail stayed consistent in every version of his report: red eyes watching from the dark. After that night, Dan Molesky resigned within weeks. He never returned to Alcatraz again. But according to later accounts, he wasn't the last person to see something inside D Block that shouldn't have been there, because Cell 14D was still waiting, and whatever was inside it had not left.
The next part of this story is so terrifying you might not have the courage to listen. Tell me, where are you listening from? How scared are you? Comment below. If new, subscribe now. After Dan McCleskey's departure, Alcatraz slowly slipped back into its familiar rhythm of tours, maintenance, and controlled silence. The incident in D Block was officially recorded as a psychological episode caused by stress and isolation. No further investigation was ordered. The cell where it happened was inspected, cleaned, and returned to service as part of the historical exhibit. But the staff who worked there knew something had changed, even if they didn't talk about it openly. In the weeks following Dan's resignation, small inconsistencies began to appear across the prison. Unexplained door locks that seemed to shift position between inspections, cold drafts that moved through sealed corridors, faint sounds of metal movement when no maintenance work was scheduled. At first, these were dismissed as aging infrastructure. The island was old. The building was older. Problems were expected. But then came the reports that could not be so easily ignored. Visitors began describing something specific, not just feelings, not just sounds, a presence. One tour group independently reported seeing a man standing near the end of D Block. He was motionless, watching them, dressed in outdated work clothing that did not match any known historical uniform. When the guide turned to address the group and then looked back, the figure was gone. No footsteps, no door movement, no explanation. What made the report unsettling was not just the sighting itself, but its repetition. Similar descriptions appeared again and again across different days, different visitors, different guides, yet always the same details: old clothing, mutton chop-style facial hair, and a silence that seemed to follow him wherever he appeared. Staff began comparing notes informally. That's when someone made the connection that none of them wanted to acknowledge. The description matched the same figure reported decades earlier at the warden's Christmas gathering, and even more disturbingly, it also resembled accounts from older prison files that had been filed away and forgotten. Files referring to unexplained activity near cell 14D. The realization created a quiet unease among the staff, because if the sightings were unrelated, they should have shown variation, but they didn't. The consistency suggested something far more deliberate, as if the same presence was moving through different eras of the island's history without changing. That was when a decision was made among senior staff to increase night surveillance in D Block. Cameras were installed, motion sensors were checked, security logs were tightened. For a brief period, nothing unusual occurred. The prison felt almost normal again, until the night the system recorded something it was never meant to capture. At 2:14 a.m., one of the D Block cameras briefly malfunctioned. When the feed returned,
A figure was visible at the far end of the corridor, standing perfectly still, facing the camera. The image lasted less than 4 seconds before the feed cut out entirely. When technicians reviewed the recording later, they noted something unusual. The temperature sensors in that section had dropped sharply at the exact same moment. But the most disturbing detail was not technical, it was visual. The figure was not entering the frame, it was already there, as if it had been waiting in the darkness the entire time. And when the camera failed, it didn't disappear, it simply stopped being visible. That footage was never officially released to the public, but word spread quietly among staff, and with it came a growing fear that whatever had been seen at Alcatraz was not tied to a single event or a single prisoner. It was something that remained, something that observed, and something that, despite the prison's closure, had never truly been left behind.
By the time the cameras failed in D Block, Alcatraz staff had already begun noticing something deeper than isolated incidents. The events were no longer random. They were forming a pattern, not in time, but in location. Almost every unexplained report, cold spots, sightings, whispers, movement in empty cells, seemed to originate from the same limited sections of the prison. D Block, and more specifically, the corridor leading to cell 14D. That detail alone unsettled the older staff members the most, because cell 14D was never just another punishment cell. It had a reputation long before modern surveillance ever existed. Old handwritten logs from guards who had worked in the 1940s and 1950s described it in cautious language. Not fear, not superstition, but hesitation. One entry mentioned unusual behavior from inmates placed inside it. Another referenced increased agitation and psychological collapse within hours. Most of those notes were vague, but one detail appeared repeatedly. The prisoners always complained about the same thing, something watching them. The reports were usually dismissed. Isolation does strange things to the mind. That was the official explanation, until modern visitors started using almost identical language without any knowledge of the old records. The same phrases, the same descriptions, red eyes, cold presence, a feeling of being observed from just beyond the edge of vision. As these similarities accumulated, a few researchers working with park archives began quietly comparing historical documents with modern accounts. What they found was unsettling. There were gaps in the records, entire periods where documentation was incomplete or missing, especially regarding incidents in D Block. One missing report referenced an inmate's death in cell 14D, but the official cause was never clearly documented. Another file described security irregularities during isolation procedures, but the details had been redacted. No explanation was provided for the omissions. When asked, senior officials simply stated that many records had been lost during transfers between administrations, but the timing of those gaps aligned too precisely with the earliest known reports of unexplained activity. At the same time, a separate pattern emerged among visitors. People who had never communicated with each other began describing the same figure, not just its appearance, but its behavior. It never approached directly. It was always observed at a distance, standing at the end of corridors, partially hidden in shadow, as if it preferred not to be seen fully. This consistency began to concern even the most skeptical staff members, because psychological suggestion could explain one or two similar reports, but not dozens, not across decades, and not with such precise repetition. One maintenance supervisor eventually summarized it in a private discussion that was never recorded officially.
If it were just imagination, it would change, but it doesn't. Despite increasing unease, life on the island continued. Tours operated, guides spoke about history, visitors took photographs, and most people left without ever experiencing anything unusual. But the ones who did reported the same thing afterward. Not fear, not confusion, but the sensation that something had noticed them, as if the island itself had briefly acknowledged their presence. It was during this period that a decision was made to review all known incidents involving D Block, Cell 14D, and the surrounding corridors. The goal was simple: find a rational explanation. What they didn't expect to find was that one of the earliest documented events might connect directly to the highest level of authority on the island at the time. A Christmas gathering, a stranger in outdated clothing, and a moment that would later be described as the beginning of something that never fully ended.
The archives at Alcatraz were never meant to be mysterious. They were supposed to be administrative. Records of prisoners, incident reports, maintenance logs. Routine documentation that, over time, would simply be stored away and forgotten. But during the deep review of D-Block activity, one file stood out immediately. It was older than the rest, and unlike most documents from that era, it had been repeatedly accessed, then partially resealed under later administrations. The label was simple: Unclassified Incident, Warden's Residence, late 1940s. Inside, there were only fragments, but those fragments told a story that closely matched modern accounts. The report described a private gathering held at the warden's residence during winter. Guests included staff members and visiting personnel. The tone of the document was unusually hesitant, as if the author struggled to describe what had occurred. According to the file, the evening began normally: music, conversation, a controlled, comfortable environment within the harsh reality of the island. Then an unidentified individual was observed inside the room. No entry point was recorded. No security breach was noted. The man simply appeared among the guests. What followed was written in a way that suggested uncertainty from the reporting officer. Witnesses described the individual as wearing outdated labor clothing, inconsistent with the period. His facial features were noted in detail, particularly his distinctive sideburns. But the most repeated observation was not visual, it was environmental. A sudden and unexplained drop in temperature throughout the room. Multiple witnesses reportedly reacted at the same time. The heating source in the room became unstable. Flames weakened. Conversation stopped. The atmosphere shifted in a way that several attendees later described as unnatural. Then, according to the file, Warden James Johnston himself approached the figure. The interaction was never fully recorded, only the outcome. The individual was no longer present afterward. No departure was witnessed, no exit was recorded. He simply ceased to exist within the space. What made the file particularly disturbing was not just the content, but the handwritten margin notes added later by a different officer. One note read, "Multiple confirmations, same description across all witnesses." Another, written years later, added, "Cross-reference with D-Block reports recommended." That annotation was never followed up publicly, but internally, it marked the first time anyone formally suggested a possible connection between the warden's residence incident and unexplained events within the prison itself. When modern investigators revisited the file decades later, they noticed something even more unsettling. The description of the unidentified figure
matched nearly perfectly with reports from cell 14D, and even more precisely with the entity later referred to in prison folklore as the Alcatraz thing. This discovery changed the direction of the investigation entirely, because if the same presence had appeared in both the most secure isolation cell and the most secure private residence on the island, then it was no longer a localized prison anomaly. It suggested something that moved freely through the structure itself, not bound to one room, not bound to one era, and not bound to the people who witnessed it. As analysts continued to compare records, another name began resurfacing in older prisoner accounts. A convict who had spent time in isolation shortly after a failed escape attempt. His name was Rufus McCain, and his time in cell 14D would become the final documented human link in the chain of events that no one could fully explain. Rufus McCain was not a man easily shaken. Before Alcatraz, he had spent years moving through the prison system with a reputation built on defiance and control. He understood violence, he understood authority, and more importantly, he understood how to survive within systems designed to break people. But isolation has its own rules, and Cell 14D did not care who he was. After the failed escape attempt in 1939, McCain and several others were separated and placed into extended solitary confinement. The records state that McCain was assigned to Cell 14D without comment. No special warning, no additional note, just a number on a sheet. The first days were predictable. He shouted at guards, he tested the door, he cursed the system that had placed him there. But as time passed, something shifted. The shouting stopped, not because he accepted his situation, but because he began listening. Guards later reported an unusual detail. Whenever they approached the corridor near 14D, McCain was often silent, not asleep, not resting, waiting. When food was delivered, he would take it without speaking, but his eyes would always move first, scanning the darkness beyond the bars, as if expecting something to appear behind the guard. After several weeks, McCain began requesting to be moved, not back into general population, but anywhere else, anywhere except 14D. His requests were denied. Administrative punishment had to be completed. That was the rule. It was during this period that his behavior became increasingly unstable. He stopped sleeping regularly. He stopped speaking altogether on some days. And when he did speak, it was often in fragments, short sentences that never formed a complete explanation. But one phrase appeared repeatedly in guard reports. "It waits when the light is gone." No one knew what he meant. At first, it was dismissed as paranoia, but then came the physical evidence. Scratch marks were found on his arms during routine checks, fresh, irregular, as if caused by fingernails. McCain refused to explain them. Instead, he only insisted that the cell was not empty. Guards searched the room multiple times, no signs of forced entry, no hidden compartments, no structural issues. Yet McCain continued insisting that something moved in the dark, something that only appeared when visibility was gone. The description he gave was always consistent, a presence that never fully formed, a shape that stayed close to the walls, and eyes, always eyes, red, still, unblinking. As the weeks progressed, McCain's psychological state deteriorated further. He began refusing to look at corners of the cell. He would turn his back only when necessary, and even then he would position himself so that he could see reflections in any available surface. Guards noted that he was effectively living in constant surveillance of his own environment, as though anticipating movement that never arrived. Eventually, his isolation period ended. He was released back into general population, but the man who returned was no longer the same. He spoke less, trusted no one, and avoided dark corridors whenever possible. Other inmates noticed his behavior immediately. Some mocked him, others kept their distance, because something about McCain had changed in a way that could not be explained. It was not fear alone, it was expectation, as if he believed that whatever had been inside cell 14D had not stayed behind. Months later, McCain was killed in a prison yard altercation. The official report labeled it a standard inmate conflict, case closed. But rumors inside the prison told a different version, one that suggested McCain did not die because of a fight, but because he hesitated at the wrong moment, as if reacting to something no one else could see, something that may have followed him out of the cell, something that never truly left 14D. And even after his death, the reports of similar sightings did not stop. They only spread further through the prison population, as if whatever McCain had encountered was still moving through the system, still watching, still waiting.
By the time Rufus McCain's story became part of unofficial prison folklore, Cell 14D had already developed a reputation that no official report could fully contain. It was no longer just a punishment cell. It was something else, something that people referred to indirectly if they spoke of it at all. Within Alcatraz, certain guards began to notice a disturbing pattern. Incidents didn't stay inside 14D. They seemed to spread outward, not physically, but psychologically. Inmates who spent time near the cell often reported changes in behavior afterward, increased paranoia, sleep disturbances, the feeling of being watched even after leaving D-Block. At first, these were treated as coincidental. The mind adapts to confinement in unpredictable ways. That was the explanation given in official briefings. But the consistency of the reports made it harder to ignore. Something about that section of the prison was affecting people in a similar way, across different time periods, across different individuals, even those who had no knowledge of the earlier incidents. One guard described it in a private conversation that was never formally recorded. It's like the feeling follows you out, not the fear, the awareness. That distinction became important later, because fear fades, but awareness does not. Meanwhile, more reports began to surface from visitors who had no connection to the prison's operational history. Tourists walking through D-Block independently reported brief, unexplained sightings, a figure at the edge of a hallway, a shadow that did not match surrounding light, a sense of something standing just outside direct vision. Most of these experiences lasted only seconds, but they left a lasting impression. People described leaving the prison with a lingering discomfort they couldn't explain. Not panic, not terror, just the feeling that something had registered their presence, as if they had been observed in return. During one routine review of visitor reports, a park supervisor noticed something that had not been formally acknowledged before. The descriptions from modern visitors matched older inmate accounts almost exactly, down to specific details. The same clothing style, the same facial structure, the same unnatural stillness, and always the same environmental shift, a sudden drop in temperature. No gradual change, just a sharp, immediate cold that seemed to arrive with the presence itself. This discovery prompted a deeper internal review. Security footage from different years was compared. Maintenance logs were cross-referenced.
Old prisoner testimonies were digitized and analyzed, and across all sources, one detail kept repeating. The entity never appeared randomly. It always appeared near transitional spaces, corridors, doorways, thresholds between light and darkness, as if it was not bound to a single location, but to movement itself. The idea was never officially accepted. It remained unconfirmed, but among staff who had worked on the island long enough, it became an unspoken understanding. Whatever had been seen in cell 14D was not confined to it. It moved, quietly and deliberately, which led investigators back to the earliest known documented incident on the island, the warden's Christmas gathering, because if the same presence could appear in a private residence and in maximum isolation cells, then its origin was not tied to prison conditions, or punishment, or even human behavior. It suggested something far older, something that had been present long before the prison was ever built. And as that realization formed, attention shifted once again toward the island itself. Not the building, not the cells, but the land beneath them, and what might have been there long before Alcatraz had a name. The next part of this story is so terrifying you might not have the courage to listen. Tell me, where are you listening from? How scared are you? Comment below. If new, subscribe now. Long before Alcatraz became a symbol of punishment and isolation, it was just an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Rocky, wind-beaten, surrounded by violent currents that made approach difficult and escape nearly impossible. Official history begins with Spanish explorers in the late 18th century who named it after the seabirds that circled above its cliffs. But there are older stories, stories that were never formally recorded, only passed down in fragments. Among local oral traditions, there were claims that the island was once used as a place of exile long before European arrival. Not as a prison in the modern sense, but as a boundary, a place where individuals were sent and never expected to return. Whether those accounts are historically accurate is still debated, but what is consistent across multiple versions is the idea of removal. People were taken there, and they did not come back. Later researchers, examining early colonial records, found references to indigenous groups in the region describing the island in cautious terms. Not sacred, not inhabited, but avoided. One account suggested it was considered a place where the water does not return what it takes. There is no way to verify the literal meaning of that phrase, but its persistence across retellings is notable. When the United States military later established a fort on the island, the transformation was practical and strategic. Cannons were installed, barracks were built, and eventually the island became a military prison, then a federal penitentiary. Each phase added structure, each phase added control, but none of them removed what some would later describe as a lingering atmosphere. By the time Alcatraz reached its peak as a high-security prison, the island had accumulated decades of human suffering, isolation, violence, desperation, and death. Official records list many of these events clearly: deaths during confinement, fatal conflicts, failed escape attempts. But what they do not account for is how those experiences might have affected the environment itself. Over time, Guards began reporting an unusual feeling when working certain sections of the prison at night, a sense of pressure, not physical, psychological, as if the structure itself was aware of their presence. Most dismissed this as imagination influenced by stress, but the reports continued across different generations of staff, different roles, different levels of experience. That consistency raised questions that had no clear answers. When combined with the later accounts from Cell 14D, D Block, and the warden's residence, a theory began to take shape among a small group of investigators. What if the island did not contain multiple unrelated hauntings? What if all of them were expressions of a single phenomenon? Something that did not originate in a specific cell or event, but instead responded to the accumulation of human emotion over time. Isolation, fear, violence, prolonged suffering, each layer adding to something that could not be easily defined. This idea was never officially accepted by any institution, but it provided a framework that explained a troubling detail shared across nearly all accounts. The presence was consistent. It did not evolve, it did not weaken, and it did not change its behavior based on time period, whether in the 1940s, the 1970s, or during modern tours. The descriptions remained strikingly similar. A silent figure, out of place in time, appearing most often near thresholds between spaces, and always accompanied by a sudden drop in temperature. This consistency led investigators to revisit the earliest documented modern encounter once again, the Christmas gathering at the warden's residence. Because if the same presence could appear before the prison's most notorious incidents, then it may not have been created by them. It may have only revealed itself through them. And that realization shifted the focus from history to something far more unsettling: continuity. As if whatever was being witnessed was not a series of events, but a single presence moving through time in different forms, waiting for the right conditions to be seen again.
By this stage, the investigation into Alcatraz had shifted from historical analysis to pattern recognition. The question was no longer what happened. It had become, where does it appear next? And the answer, disturbingly, was becoming more consistent. Every confirmed sighting, whether from inmates, guards, or modern visitors, shared a spatial similarity. The presence did not linger in open areas. It did not appear in crowded spaces. It avoided constant movement. Instead, it seemed to prefer boundaries, doorways, corridors, corners where visibility broke, and most frequently, locations where light transitioned into darkness. Researchers began referring to this behavior informally as threshold positioning, a pattern that suggested intent, not randomness. One park employee described it during a private interview that was never officially recorded. It doesn't stand in a room. It stands where a room ends. This observation became central to later analysis because it suggested that the entity was not simply appearing, it was positioning itself, as if it understood structure and was using it. At the same time, archived reports from Cell 14D began to receive renewed attention. Inmates had repeatedly described the sensation of being watched from corners of darkness that were not directly visible. But more importantly, they described something else: the feeling that movement itself was unsafe, that turning away, even briefly, created vulnerability. Modern psychologists reviewing these accounts suggested that prolonged isolation could produce hallucinations shaped by environmental expectation. But this explanation failed to account for one critical detail. The same descriptions appeared in people
who had no exposure to prison conditions. Visitors, staff, even individuals who were unaware of the island's history at the time of their experience. Despite this, their language remained consistent, a presence at the edge of perception, a figure that seemed aware of being observed, and an immediate environmental change whenever it appeared. Cold air, sudden, localized, unnatural in its intensity. One maintenance report described it in mechanical terms: temperature drop too rapid for environmental cause. That line was later highlighted during internal review because it suggested something measurable, not just perceived. As the data accumulated, a troubling hypothesis emerged among a small group of researchers studying the reports informally. What if the phenomenon was not tied to individuals at all? Not prisoners, not guards, not visitors, but to spatial transitions themselves. The idea was speculative, but it aligned with every recorded sighting. The presence never appeared randomly within open space. It appeared when movement occurred between states, light to dark, room to corridor, inside to outside. And it always seemed to react after being noticed, not before. This implied awareness, or at minimum, responsivity. The implications were difficult to accept because it suggested that observation itself might be part of the interaction, that seeing it was not passive, it was mutual. This theory brought investigators back to the earliest known incident again, the Christmas gathering, because that moment contained all known conditions: a confined interior space, multiple witnesses, a sudden environmental change, and a figure that appeared without entry and disappeared without exit. It was the first documented instance that matched every later pattern, which raised a final question that no one on the team wanted to ask directly. If the presence was bound to thresholds, then was it already inside the structure long before Cell 14D was ever built? Or was the prison itself simply one of many places where it had learned to manifest more clearly? At this point, the investigation reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Every answer only created a larger gap in understanding. And within that gap, the same pattern continued to appear. Quiet, patient, and unchanged. After years of scattered reports, theories, and conflicting interpretations, Alcatraz installed a modern surveillance system across D Block. Motion sensors, infrared cameras, environmental monitoring equipment. The goal was simple: finally capture something undeniable. For a brief period, the system appeared to confirm nothing unusual. Footage showed empty corridors, still cells, routine patrols, normal prison conditions preserved as historical space. But that changed on a night when the island was experiencing unusually heavy fog rolling in from the bay. At approximately 2:14 a.m., multiple sensors in D Block registered a sudden environmental shift. Temperature dropped sharply in a localized section of the corridor near Cell 14D. Not gradually, instantly. The system flagged it as an anomaly. Seconds later, one of the cameras switched to infrared mode automatically. What it recorded was subtle at first: an empty corridor, no movement, no visible cause for the temperature change. Then, at the far end of the frame, something appeared. Not entering, not walking in, just present, standing at the edge of visibility. The system struggled to stabilize focus. For a brief moment, the figure became clearer. A human-like silhouette, out of place, still, facing directly toward the camera. Operators reviewing the footage later noted a disturbing detail. The figure did not adjust its position in response to the camera. It was already oriented toward it, as if it had been aware of the device before it activated. Within seconds, the feed began to distort. Static interference spread across the image. Audio channels recorded a low-frequency hum that had no identifiable source. Then, the system failed completely. When backup cameras were checked, they showed nothing abnormal. No figure, no temperature drop, no anomaly. Only the brief memory of the initial feed remained on the corrupted file. That file was immediately flagged and stored in restricted archives. It was never released publicly. But internal analysis revealed one detail that technicians could not explain. The moment the figure appeared, every motion sensor in adjacent corridors simultaneously registered activity, even though no movement was visible on any camera, as if the system had detected something that it could not display. This discrepancy led to renewed concern among staff, because it suggested that the presence was not simply optical, it was environmental, something that affected both perception and measurement. Around the same time, additional visitor reports began to surface again. Tourists independently describing a man in old clothing standing at the end of hallways. Some claimed he appeared only in photographs after leaving the island, not during the visit, but later, when reviewing images at home. The consistency of these accounts forced staff to reconsider earlier assumptions. It was no longer just about isolated sightings. It was about persistence, the inability of the phenomenon to remain fully contained by time or documentation. Each attempt to record it seemed to fail in the same way. It would appear, it would be observed, and then it would vanish from every reliable system of confirmation except memory. And even that, according to some researchers, was not entirely stable, because different witnesses remembered slightly different details, yet always agreed on the core elements: the cold, the silence, the figure, and the feeling of being noticed in return. As these findings accumulated, investigators revisited the most consistent element across all eras of reports: not the appearance, not the sound, but the location. Every confirmed or strongly reported encounter still pointed back to one place: the corridor leading to cell 14D, which raised a final operational concern. If the phenomenon was not tied to time and not tied to individuals, then its persistence in that corridor suggested something structural, something anchored, something still present, waiting beneath years of observation and still not fully understood. At the center of it all remained the same unanswered question: was cell 14D a place where something appeared, or a place where something was always waiting to be seen?
By the time the final internal review began, most of the staff involved in earlier investigations had either retired or transferred off the island. Only a small team remained, and even fewer were willing to speak openly about what they had experienced. But the data they had collected over the years was impossible to ignore. Multiple decades, multiple witnesses, multiple systems of observation, all pointing toward the same conclusion. Whatever was associated with cell 14D was not confined by normal operational boundaries. It did not behave like a typical anomaly. It behaved like something persistent, something that returned. The decision was made to conduct one final controlled inspection of the D-block corridor, specifically focusing on the stretch leading to cell 14D. All surveillance systems were activated simultaneously. Every camera angle, every sensor,
every available recording device. The goal was to eliminate ambiguity, to capture a clear, uninterrupted sequence of events. The inspection began just after midnight. The corridor was empty, as expected. For the first several minutes, nothing unusual occurred. No movement, no temperature fluctuations, no sensor activity. Then, without warning, one of the motion detectors registered a brief spike, not large, but precise, centered exactly at the midpoint of the corridor. The team reviewed live footage immediately. Nothing was visible. Yet the sensors continued to fluctuate in patterns that suggested presence without form. Then came the temperature drop, faster than any previously recorded instance. Within seconds, the corridor registered a cold so sudden that condensation formed on nearby surfaces. Operators confirmed the readings in real time. At the same moment, every camera feed in D-Block briefly synchronized to a single frame distortion, a visual interruption that lasted less than a second. When the image stabilized, something was present, standing in the corridor. Not walking, not entering, just there, facing forward, motionless. The team froze. No one spoke. For several seconds, the feed remained stable. The figure did not move. Then one operator attempted to zoom in. That action coincided with an immediate system-wide failure across all connected cameras. Every screen in the control room cut to static. Backup systems activated automatically, but they displayed only empty corridors. No figure, no anomaly, nothing. Yet the environmental sensors continued to register presence, as if something remained in the corridor, even when it could no longer be visually confirmed. This contradiction caused immediate concern, because it meant the phenomenon was not dependent on visual detection. It existed outside of standard observation. The inspection was aborted within minutes. All personnel were ordered to evacuate the D-Block monitoring area. But before the final shutdown was completed, one last recording was recovered from a secondary backup channel. It contained only a few seconds of usable footage. In it, the corridor is visible, empty at first. Then a brief distortion appears near cell 14D. A shape begins to form at the edge of the frame, not entering from anywhere visible, just assembling from darkness. And at the exact moment it becomes recognizable, the recording ends. No further data was retrieved. That file was classified immediately, and the corridor leading to cell 14D was officially marked as restricted access pending structural review. But unofficially, among the remaining staff, a different decision was made. No one would enter that corridor alone again, because whatever had been recorded that night confirmed what many had suspected for years. The presence was not a memory of the prison. It was still there, and it had finally acknowledged being seen clearly. After the final inspection failed, Alcatraz entered a phase of quiet restriction. Public explanations were carefully worded. Technical malfunction, sensor errors, unverified anomalies. Nothing more. Officially, there was no reason for concern. Unofficially, the island had become a place where certain areas were no longer spoken about, especially the corridor leading to cell 14D. Access to D-Block was reduced. Tours were redirected. Security personnel were instructed to avoid unnecessary entry into restricted sections. But even with these precautions, reports did not stop. They only changed form. Instead of controlled inspections or structured tours, sightings now came from chance encounters. a maintenance worker passing too close to a closed corridor, a guide catching movement in peripheral vision during a routine walkthrough, a visitor reviewing photographs later and noticing something that had not been visible at the time. The descriptions remained consistent across all cases: a figure in outdated clothing, still, silent, out of place in time, and always associated with an immediate drop in temperature. But what changed was the reaction of those who encountered it. Earlier reports described fear, confusion, shock. Now there was something else: recognition, as if people were no longer just seeing something unknown. They were beginning to expect it. One senior staff member described it during a private internal discussion. "It doesn't feel like it's appearing anymore. It feels like it's continuing." That statement became the closest thing to a conclusion the investigation ever reached, because it suggested continuity rather than emergence, as if the presence was not returning, but persisting, across time, across observers, across environments. The Orden's Christmas incident, the isolated reports from Cell 14D, the Ranger's experience in D Block, the modern camera failures, all of it began to form a single, uninterrupted line of events, not separate hauntings, not isolated anomalies, but one sustained phenomenon expressing itself through different moments in the island's history. And yet, even with this understanding, the core mystery remained unchanged. No origin point could be confirmed, no source identified, no clear beginning located in any official record. The earliest known appearance remained the same unexplained moment in the warden's residence: a stranger in outdated clothing, a sudden drop in temperature, a disappearance without exit. Everything that followed seemed to echo that initial event, as if the island had not created the phenomenon, but revealed it. And in the final review of all collected data, one last observation was recorded by an analyst who chose to remain anonymous. It was not written as a theory, not as speculation, but as a note added to the end of a classified file. It read, "If every account is connected, then the question was never what it is. The question is whether it ever stopped being here at all." That file was never reopened. The investigation was officially closed. Alcatraz continued operating as a historic site. Visitors still walk its corridors, guides still tell its stories, and most people leave without anything unusual happening. But according to those few who have experienced something they cannot fully explain, there are moments inside D Block when the silence changes, when the air turns cold without reason, and when the shadows feel slightly deeper than they should, and when, for just a brief second, it feels like something is standing at the end of the corridor, not arriving, not leaving, just continuing, as if it was never part of the past and never truly gone, only waiting for the next time someone looks in its direction and realizes too late that it has already been looking back.
Tonight's story ends here, but the mystery is far from over. As midnight approaches, fear awakens. Follow us now for more spine-tingling horrors, if you can handle it.